Welcome everybody. Thank you for coming to my presentation. My name is Keon Bliss. I am the Grassroots Volunteer Coordinator for the Move to Amend Coalition. And for those of you who aren't familiar with us, Move to Amend is a national campaign working to amend the U.S. Constitution to unequivocally state that corporations are not people with constitutional rights, money is not equal to protected political speech, so that it can be regulated in elections. So I got my start with Move to Amend really as an intern back in the fall of 2013. And the reason that what first inspired me to join Move to Amend is because I felt that it was one of the few organizations that was honestly and authentically approaching and trying to tackle the most serious systemic issues that we face in this country today, namely corporate rule. But what separates Move to Amend from this, from other organizations kind of working in the general amendment scene / money and getting money out of politics movements, is that our strategy specifically focuses on building a grassroots movement from the ground up that is multiracial, intergenerational, and across the classes. We believe that we cannot get through we cannot pass an amendment such as the 28th Amendment to the Constitution without a unified movement that reaches across the issues and actually acknowledges the deep systemic issues such as racism, white supremacy, cisgender heteropatriarchy, and classism together. We can't simply put these under the rug. We can't ask people to simply to come join our movement and put down what they're doing. We have to work in solidarity and organize in solidarity together. So we're going to go through just an overview of what Move to Amend does. We're going to frame out the big picture a little bit and then jump into the power dynamics that we currently have versus what we envision. And then get into some clarifying questions after we discuss the power dynamic, and then jump into what we can do, collectively as coalitions, as intersecting movements, and then also how to get involved with Move to Amend specifically. Move to Amend is a coalition of hundreds of organizations and hundreds of thousands of individuals committed to social and economic justice, ending corporate rule, and building a vibrant, authentic democracy that is genuinely accountable to all people, regardless of race, sex, or class, and not corporate interests. The goals of which we carry out our mission is by first passing the We the People Amendment, proposed 28th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution that would make clear that artificial entities created by state law, that includes for-profit corporations, that includes unions, that includes nonprofit organizations like Move to Amend, and other limited liability companies, to make clear that they do not have inherent inalienable rights under the Constitution, and that money is not a form of protected political speech as recognized by the Supreme Court. One of our secondary goals is to provoke discussion and organizing about how to make the promise of American democracy through constitutional renewal real. And we don't believe that this is going to be an easy lift. We don't think of this as an end-all, be-all solution. This is really just the first step towards opening the door for a genuine conversation about the kind of democracy that we envision. So what are our principles and values? Move to Amend is a firm believer in anti-oppression and solidarity organizing. We believe that we need to work together and authentically and build relationships with those on the front lines of the impacts of corporate rule, particularly with communities of color, which I will explain as to why later on. But we don't believe that we can build a mutual governance structure without including the voices of those who are always left out from the beginning. We are strong believers in coalition and movement building, which is why we work across intersecting issues, which the issue of money in politics and corporate constitutional rights is one of the few issues that intersects with nearly everything that we care about. And we believe that this structure has to be built from the ground up, which is why one of our core principles is grassroots organizing. We don't believe in top-down leadership. It has to be, we take direction from the people at their local communities, and we have to meet and build relationships with them where people are and work with the issues that matter most in their communities. We are strongly dedicated to continuous political education, which is why many Move to an End volunteers undergo what we call movement education to not only examine the history of how the United States came to be, but we also examine the systems of oppression that have existed from the beginning in the United States, and also encourage and have honest and candid discussion how these systems of oppression both benefit and disadvantage us within our communities and put us against each other. We also believe in keeping our political and economic independence, which is why Move to Amend refuses any kind of high-value donations from large corporations, political parties, and why we maintain a specific transpartisan position. We do not endorse political candidates or parties of any kind, regardless of how much they support us or how much we agree with them. This is in order so that we can continue to build an authentic movement that is independent of the current structures, especially the two-party system that currently has led us to the current level of corruption and the chronic lack of democracy which we all experience. So I'm going to frame out the big picture a little bit. With an easy question. Why do we need to abolish corporate constitutional rights? Well, for those who don't know, corporations under the United States Constitution currently have rights under the 1st, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and the 14th Amendments. 14th Amendment is in particular the linchpin towards the court-created doctrine of corporate constitutional rights. Basically, what the court has said is that corporations are considered persons under the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. And because they are entitled to equal protection, they are also entitled to due process and also allowed to exercise their rights equally, just as ordinary human beings, just like you and me. Beyond just this, because these corporations are recognized as persons under the 14th Amendment, this goes beyond what many of you probably heard about, the Supreme Court decision in 2010, Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission, which was the first court case that officially recognized corporations as having First Amendment rights to free speech, which allows them to spend unlimited amounts of money in independent political advocacy. And why can they spend unlimited amounts of money in political advocacy as free speech? Because the court has also recognized that money, or that more specifically, the raising and spending of political money in elections is a form of protected political speech, which opened the floodgates to tens of billions of dollars going into our electoral process, influencing local and state ballot campaigns, and generally buying off our elected officials and representatives for the express purpose of serving corporate interests. So we've established, how this goes beyond Citizens United, and how do we get here exactly? Specifically, from the beginning, we have had a chronic lack of representation in government of nearly all demographics, except predominantly white male property owners, those with wealth. Even in 2017, we still have a low representation of women in our U.S. Congress. We still have an underrepresentation of people, of Black and Indigenous people of color, particularly Indigenous people. Even though they make 1% of the population, they're still struggling even to get in the basic foothold into the system of government that we've set up. We also have a lack of people from the LGBTQA plus community. And of course, there are a severe number, most of the members of Congress are millionaires who have never experienced poverty, or who basically have do not understand the experience of what it is to live low income and struggling from paycheck to paycheck. We also have a chronic lack of democracy in the fact that there are barriers to voting. the United States was first founded, there was a significant number of poll taxes, which basically prevented anyone who wasn't already wealthy or who didn't own property who were considered property themselves from actually participating in the democratic process. And not to mention, most recently, we're also dealing with the struggle of making sure that people have identification so that they can vote because of numerous voter ID laws that have been risen across the country over the last couple decades. And then we also are dealing with basically prevent felons from participating in the democratic process too. In nearly half the states across the country, there is some type of law that prevents convicted felons or anybody convicted of crimes, no matter what their offense, no matter how nonviolent it was, from actually participating and getting the right to vote. Some of them, they can earn their rights back, but for a large number of them, millions in fact, they are permanently denied from ever participating within the democratic process. This is simply unacceptable. And what's also unacceptable is the amount of money that is currently spent in our campaigns. Now, we recognized after 2010, and we saw how much our elections ended up costing each consecutive general election cycle, billions of dollars each year, which, if we turn the clock back though to 2009, this was actually not much different than what it was back in 1998. In fact, in the year 2010, the general election during that time actually cost about $3.6 billion. But in 1998, there was about half as much spent in those elections, about $1.6 billion in 1998. So, and if we'll also look at not just how much is spent in elections on political advertisements, on candidates themselves, think about how we decided our candidates in the primary process. Usually it's very few candidates that are already predetermined by the two major political parties, Democrats and Republicans, but it also has record low participation within that process. Generally about 10% of the population or less than, or fewer, will actually participate within the primary process to select the candidates who will ultimately run on the general election ballot. Apart from that as well is that we do not have, of those 10% or so, even fewer are actually represented by the two political parties. In the last election, in fact, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton won 20% of the total population out of 251 eligible voters, those people who are of voting age, and then Donald Trump won 19% of all eligible voters, which, as we can see, less than half of the population actually got to participate in the selection of our president, which ultimately was still taken out of our hands by the Electoral College. So we can see that we have, long before Citizens United, we have never really had a genuine democracy where all people were represented. And we're still struggling for that, and it's really hasn't changed much since the beginning, though we have made impressive strides and progress. Those changes are still largely marginal. So how do corporate elites use corporate constitutional rights to basically, the easy answer is that they use it to overturn locally enacted environmental protections. Think of laws that are passed like the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Acts and so forth. How many of these major corporate polluters oftentimes are recorded as being severe violators multiple times over, and yet only get a slap on the wrist, basically a couple $1 million of fines, which might account for about an hour's worth of their total annual revenue. They also use their corporate owners, specifically the people who own the corporations that are considered persons, also use those rights to justify locating their corporations in communities that are most vulnerable and marginalized, which are typically low-income communities of color. They locate here because they are the path of least resistance. Why are they there? Basically, a 2016 study that was published in the environmental research papers was actually found that over a 30-year period, race was the single biggest determinant factor for where toxic and hazardous waste facilities would be located. How do they do this? Basically through a lack of political and economic resources. If you don't have the support and the funding to thwart these toxic facilities that are built near low-income communities, how can you fight back and prevent your communities from getting contaminated by these toxic facilities? And then what do we do when our elected officials at city council or the county supervisors level approve these permits and approve these land acquisitions that allow these toxic facilities to get built? Well, we basically suppress the population from actually participating in the process. We saw that most notably in the 2016 elections, where there were voter ID laws, despite being found to be unconstitutional and deliberately targeting people based upon their race. We still allowed those laws to carry into effect. Some states like Georgia deliberately dragged their feet in the electoral process and basically refused to file late-term voter applications, even though they were mandated by courts to do that. Even some states, like my own home state of Indiana, actually used the state police to raid local voter registration offices in order to secure the voter rolls that were being submitted, and then basically prevent hundreds of thousands of people from actually participating in the process. So this isn't an accident of how corporate rights are used to basically abuse and undermine our own rights expressed under the Constitution. So environmental disasters, obviously they are both natural occurring and they are also man-made. Most recently we're seeing the effects of man-made climate change that is happening with stronger storms, greater levels of precipitation. We saw that most recently with Hurricane Harvey. That basically sacked Houston, which is a predominantly black community, and has ended up dumping upwards of about over 50 inches of rain within just a few days, which I believe the total gallons amount was over 3 trillion gallons of water, which, if that had all fallen here in California, would have gotten us out of our 5-year drought within 5 days, basically. Absolutely crazy, right? When these environmental disasters happen, they are felt worse among the communities on the front lines, which are typically low-income communities of color. Black and brown populations they're more likely to be exposed to toxic pollutants from these major corporate polluters, more than 40% more likely than just white communities. And on top of the general systemic discrimination that they're currently dealing with, and unequal treatment, and lack of funding and support, the amount of time it takes for these communities to recover from storms is exponentially longer than communities with more wealth and who are more homogeneously white. We see that most recently. We saw that with Hurricane Katrina that happened during the George Bush years, where many places in New Orleans are still recovering from that disaster, which are predominantly black communities that are recovering from that. And the Houston area is more likely going to take at least 10 years to recover from that as well. And that isn't even getting into the fact that many of the toxic chemical companies that were on the coastline surrounding Houston flooded, and basically people are still being affected by the spillage and leakage of chemicals into the floodwaters. So it's pretty, just to give some example and context with these examples. We're seeing here, this is what Houston, Texas looks like. Hurricane Harvey, before Hurricane Irma, was actually one of the strongest Atlantic hurricanes on record coming into the Gulf Coast region. It hit a Category 4 at land mass and basically just has flooded and dumped an exponential amount of rain, more so than any meteorologist or climate scientist has seen ever. because of the amount of rainwater that was dropped, many of the chemical plants surrounding the Houston area basically were unable to use their backup generators to keep many of these chemicals cool. Many of those plants, some of those plants actually had to just evacuate outright, and their owners basically said, there's nothing we can do, this plant is about to explode and or catch fire, which it ultimately did. There were several explosions, some of those which are still happening right now. And you can see right here how the chemical storage facilities were also flooded in this, and that those facilities, all those communities and homes and businesses located just downstream were all being contaminated by these. All the people that were still stuck and waiting for rescue had to sit in these toxic waters for hours, some even days at a time. And it's still, and the cleanup is still happening and will likely take weeks, months, maybe even years to clean up. Just last year, Standing Rock, North Dakota, was the site of a major resistance movement among the Dakota and Lakota people to prevent the Dakota Access Pipeline, which is being built by Energy Transfer Partners. You can see how the pipeline is basically being dug directly into treaty protected lands under the 1851 Laramie Treaty, which the Energy Transfer Partners and North Dakota basically ceded this land in violation of that contract, which is why there was such a massive occupation and resistance to this oil pipeline, which, as many of us are finding out now, oil pipelines are the most dangerous way to transport crude oil in the United States. And it's not a matter of if these pipelines will rupture, it's merely a matter of when. And this pipeline in particular was set to go under Lake Oahe, which is a major water source not far connected to the Missouri River, which feeds into the Mississippi River, and is a major water source for millions of people, up to 10 million people. And funny story about this, they were originally talking about digging the pipeline through Bismarck, which is a predominantly white community, about over 90% white. And the city council outright refused to support that pipeline and ultimately rejected it. So what did Energy Transfer Partners do? It decided to reroute its pipeline through treaty-protected indigenous lands, which is what happened, which is why you see the massive resistance, not just from local Dakota people, but from across the country. And then you can also see uniformed South Dakota police officers and sheriff deputies actively fighting the water protectors and defending Energy Transfer Partners' corporate oil pipeline. This oil spill right here is actually not from the pipeline itself. That was actually from a pipeline spillage that happened, I believe it was 2014, which not far from Standing Rock, it dumped upwards of 100,000 gallons, over 150,000 gallons worth of oil into the surrounding farmlands, which are still, as far as we know, still being cleaned up. But thanks to corporate media, we probably won't see any or hear about any of that development or recovery efforts. Detroit and Flint, Michigan are big examples of how corporate rule directly undermines our rights to a safe and clean environment. Flint, Michigan switched its water supply from the Detroit River and decided to pull it from the Flint River, which is already contaminated from the local auto plants that produce the cars that we drive, and it wasn't discovered that this water supply was contaminated with lead, which state of Michigan, under the management of an unelected emergency manager, basically withheld that information and allowed the water to go through pipes without the chemical necessary to break down and protect the corrosion of pipes due to the contaminated water. So it ended up, all that pipe contamination, which we used to use lead pipes, basically flooded into the water supply of Flint residents, which is a predominantly black community, and they were forced to live, drink, and bathe in lead-contaminated water for up to 2 years. In fact, the crisis is still happening. Many people still cannot cook, they cannot bathe, they cannot drink without using bottled water to basically keep themselves from being contaminated, which a whole generation of Flint children will have to deal with the effects of bathing in lead-contaminated water. Lead poisoning is permanent. There is no reversal. It doesn't go away. Detroit, Michigan wasn't left much better off. They may not have had the level of contamination as Flint, but they were dealing with a water crisis where local Detroit water utility decided to collect on bills in order to cover its bankruptcy, one of the largest municipal bankruptcies in the United States, and basically shut off water for over 300,000 people, basically. And those are still going on. You can see the lines of people, mostly black Detroiters, waiting to pay their bills so that their water doesn't get shut off. And this was actually condemned back in 2015 by the UN Human Rights Council as a violation of basic human rights to water. Even here in Santa Barbara, California, we recently had our own oil spill that happened not far along off the coast. This was only, I'm blanking on the level of pollution that actually went in, but you can see from the aerial pictures the amount of oil that was spilled right off the coastline. The Refugio pipeline, you can see right here how there is literally just surrounding field producers and oil companies that have put up shop and are basically producing highly toxic oil, natural gas pipelines, and so forth, all up and down the California seaboard. And this is just one example in California. You can also see it here in Richmond, North Richmond in particular, the Ring of Fire that are produced by Chevron and other companies that have, where Richmond residents have basically been fighting for decades to hold Chevron accountable for toxic gas releases that have killed local plants and wildlife, and forced people into their homes and forced them to deal with toxic fumes that they couldn't that they literally had to make sure that they were not breathing in. Anyone who's from Richmond might know of the times when you have to literally shelter in place basically and just cover your mouths. I mean, this is not a coincidence. This isn't some aberration that just happened overnight or over the last couple of years. This has been a systemic issue literally dating back more than a century. So, you know, corporations primarily exist to maximize the wealth and profit for their shareholders, thanks to a Supreme Court ruling in Dodge versus Ford back in 1919. Before then, they were actually, corporations were created by state law. They were only allowed to be incorporated for an express public benefit. They had to serve the public good. Their purpose had to be specific, and they were limited in their scope. So whatever purpose that they were set out to do, they could only work upon that purpose. But thanks to this decision, that basically freed corporations to ultimately choose to maximize their profits at the cost of human life, livelihood, and destruction of the natural environment. And because of this prioritization of property over human well-being and environmental sustainability, they are allowed to externalize their costs onto the most marginalized and vulnerable communities, primarily black and brown communities of color. It also creates greater disparities in their pollution exposure, leading to long-term health problems that they deal with at an exponential rate compared to the rest of the country, severe environmental damages that take years, if not decades, to get over, and then it also, of course, widens inequality and creates a vicious cycle of poverty and health problems that is virtually inescapable. So what happened to our rights to self-government? Why can't we exercise local sovereignty as was intended by as we were promised by the original founders of the United States? So here's what the democracy that we envision that we were originally promised, through the course of our nation's history. We, the people of the United States, because we are free and sovereign, because we hold all the political power, but we delegate some of our power to government that is subordinate and accountable. We assign government duties, which they discharge by writing laws in the public interest, but no law can violate the private rights of individual citizens. That'd be fantastic practice, right? That would be amazing if we actually practice this. Why don't we practice this in this country? Simply put, reality is starker than our imaginations. The Constitution was written back in 1789, which, as many of us know, was a time of vast racial, gender, and class inequality. It was originally written as a property rights document. If you look at the original draft of the U.S. Constitution, it was literally devoid of all human rights. It literally dealt only with contracts held by its landowners, and then also only dealt with the commerce powers of the federal government. But it wouldn't have passed without human rights added into it. There was actually a small little rebellion within the Constitutional Congress that passed this, and they were forced to add the Bill of Rights, which included just some basic human rights that are expected of all human beings, literally as an afterthought. So we are founded basically on a property rights document, not on a human rights document. Furthermore, it failed to define who was a person protected under the Constitution. So at the time of its creation, the only people that were recognized as persons worthy of constitutional protection were basically the people who wrote it, white male property owners, many of whom owned human beings as slaves. What this excluded women from the Constitution. This excluded black and indigenous people of color, and also basically codified slavery into its law and the subjugation and conquering of native lands, and basically allowed land theft, in which every single piece of land that we are currently standing on used to be owned by original indigenous inhabitants. And it also excluded impoverished white men. White men who did not own property themselves could not participate within the democratic process. Now, we have fought long and hard over the last 2 centuries to amend the Constitution to add further human rights to the document. We've succeeded 27 times to pass such amendments. And as much needed as that progress was, all of these were still largely marginal, because as we can see, we're still dealing with the problem of systemic racism, sexism, and classism that was rampant within the founding revolutionary period back then. However, the one thing that has remained consistent throughout the course of the Constitution's history is that there has been no mention of corporations within that document. In fact, the framers were wise in noting that to empower corporations to have standing within constitutional law would greatly diminish the ability of individual Americans to exercise their own rights. Because if you can pool your resources and risk together for a single organization, how can an ordinary individual compete with that? So they were smart about it, and they were explicit in excluding corporations from that. But thanks to the Supreme Court, they opened the door for corporations to gain a foothold using the 14th Amendment. So for those of you who already know, 14th Amendment was originally intended for black Americans to protect their civil rights and give them equal protection and standing and due process under the law following slavery's abolition. However, it didn't take more than 2 decades before corporations and their corporate executives were able to insert themselves and gain a foothold into this amendment, in this case built right here in the Bay Area, Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad of 1886. Now, for those legal scholars in the room, this wasn't the decision that cemented corporate constitutional rights, also known as corporate personhood, into the amendment or into the Constitution, but what it did was give them a foothold to claim personhood by a law clerk who erroneously interpreted the Supreme Court's ruling as recognizing corporations as persons under the Equal Protection Clause. And because of this erroneous ruling, it was allowed to be cemented in Pembina Consolidated Silver Mining versus Pennsylvania in 1888, and Minneapolis and St. Louis Railway versus Beckwith in 1889, where that case was the one that explicitly locked corporate personhood under the Equal Protection and Due Process Clauses into the court's jurisprudence. Notice a pattern here of how corporate polluters basically worked to insert their artificial entities created by the state into personhood law. In the 30 years after the 14th Amendment was passed and after the 1886 Santa Clara County decision, the 14th Amendment was applied in court cases 288 times to corporations versus 17 times for African Americans. So basically, the 14th Amendment since then has been used more times to protect corporations than the people that it was originally intended to do. Can anybody guess off the top of their head when the 14th Amendment was first applied to women? It'll make you sick a little bit. 1971, Reed versus Reed. Yeah, that was the first time that the court actually applied the 14th Amendment to apply to women under the Equal Protection Clause. Yes. So corporations can literally claim to have been recognized as persons with equal protection longer than Black Americans and women, which is sickening. And of course, Black, Brown, Indigenous, all of us have basically been struggling for recognition under constitutional law, under the basic laws of locals and states, and corporations were able to get a foothold and get claim under that by no form of democratic process whatsoever, simply by court rulings. But that wasn't all. The court also opened from those decisions, the court also opened the door for them to claim Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable search and seizure. The notable case being Hale versus Henkel in 1906, when corporations were given constitutional immunity for their books and records against regulators who wanted to review them. Furthermore, later in 1978, Marshall versus Barlow's Incorporated, corporations were given the right to demand search warrants in order for government to fill out their regulatory mandates passed by local, state, and federal laws, particularly under the Occupational Safety and Health Act. So the federal government, which is tasked with holding corporations accountable since they were created by state law, basically now has to ask corporations for the privilege of inspecting their plants for any kind of safety, health, or environmental violations. Goes deeper. Fifth Amendment's rights to due process, protection against takings, and double jeopardy clauses. So not satisfied with just Fourth Amendment and 14th Amendment rights, the Supreme Court saw fit to give them, or to recognize standing for corporations under the Fifth Amendment. First off, they were able to get a foothold with this amendment in Noble versus Union River Logging back in 1893, which basically recognized that government cannot deprive corporations of their property without due process, which in this particular case involved the Interior Secretary, I believe, revoking corporate charter based upon the maps in which it was originally designated and approved under. Court decided no, that was a violation of their constitutional right. But it was further cemented and clarified that they are full persons with Fifth Amendment rights when in Pennsylvania Coal Company versus Mahon, 1922, the court recognized regulations, which include environmental regulations, as a form of takings. And because we are entitled to just compensation for any property that's taken by government, corporations were entitled to just compensation for any lost profits due to those regulations. How did this come to be? Basically, Pennsylvania Coal Company was mining under small towns in Pennsylvania for coal, and were creating large sinkholes under homes and contaminating local water supplies. So the state passed an environmental ordinance that basically prevented them from doing that. But Pennsylvania Coal Company sued all the way to the Supreme Court, where they recognized those environmental ordinances as being a form of takings and Fifth Amendment rights for corporations. So local, state, and federal governments now have to worry that any environmental ordinances that they pass can ultimately be challenged by a corporation, and then the cost of those laws are ultimately going to be exponentially more expensive because they're going to have to provide them for any money that the court determines the corporation is due to lost profits. And then, of course, they were given standing with Fong Fu versus the United States in 1962 to the Double Jeopardy Clause, where they basically said that government cannot bring defendants, including legal fictions like corporations, to trial twice for the same charge. So, if we recognize corporations like ExxonMobil as having been putting them on trial for lying about climate change for decades, and we lose in court, that's our chance. That was our only chance to actually hold them accountable for that. Yep. So we see a little bit how corporations, over the last 150 years have been able to insert their way into the U.S. Constitution. Over the 130 years since 1886. But it wasn't until the First Amendment was brought in, the court brought into it, where corporations really hit their stride with how much power and influence they could wield over local, state, and federal governments. So the court in Buckley versus Vallejo in 1976 opened the door for political spending, money, as being a form of protected political speech, and it struck down part of campaign finance laws while not extending First Amendment free speech rights to corporations just yet. It was further after corporate lawyer for the big tobacco industry, Justice Lewis K. Powell, joined the court back in the 1970s, did he get his first big insert into giving corporations standing to influence local, state, and federal elections, particularly in First National Bank of Boston versus Bellotti in 1978. Which basically prevented the state of Massachusetts from prohibiting corporate spending intended for influencing or affecting voters' opinions through the expense of media ads. So the corporation basically cannot be limited in how much money it spends on political advocacy to influence voters' opinions. It's pretty convenient for mega corporations like ExxonMobil, who were found to be lying for 40 years about climate change, spending money to question and debate the science, even as their own scientists had already identified that climate change was real and that human greenhouse gas emissions were causing it. So move on up to the 1990s, International Dairy Foods Association versus Amstel. A local Vermont town the state of Vermont passed an ordinance basically saying that dairy food corporations were required to report any milk that was produced from cows using bovine growth hormone. The International Dairy Foods Association basically challenged this in court, claiming that they had a First Amendment right not to speak on whether or not they were using cows that had BGH in them. So the court sided with them, basically recognizing that corporations had a right not to speak through their political or commercial speech, including statements of fact or opinion. Pretty convenient if you're looking to lie and deceive the public for many years. But it really hit the fan when Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission came about in 2010. Basically, corporations and unions were recognized as having a right to unlimited spending in independent political advocacy in our electoral process. And that the spending of money in elections was not, in fact, inherent corruption or the appearance of corruption. Right. So this is what opened the floodgates to allow corporations to spend unlimited amounts of money in political advocacy, so long as they didn't coordinate directly with campaigns, which, as we can see in the last 2 major election cycles, that's basically just window dressing, and many independent candidates for president, even for Congress and local races, now operate in tangent or in parallel with their super PACs. So that, of course, opened the door for McCutcheon versus FEC, which struck down some aggregate limits on individual donations. So not only can corporations, unions, and nonprofit organizations spend in independent political advocacy, but now their owners are allowed to spend more than the $5,600 electoral cycle limit, which basically allowed them to spend up to $1 million or more dollars supporting the candidate or party of their choice. The owners, on top of what their corporations also spend in independent political advocacy. And then, of course, in the same year, the Supreme Court recognized First Amendment rights to certain religious freedoms, specifically closed family-owned corporations like Hobby Lobby, which basically allows them to deny health insurance coverage under their employer plans that they required under the Affordable Care Act from providing contraception and abortion services to women. So not only do they have free speech rights, but they now also have standing to claim religious rights. See the pattern that's emerging right here? Many of these I mentioned are corporate polluters themselves, or working in industries that have a direct effect on our environment. And large corporations, due to their nature, are able to use their resources and their influence to assert their rights better than small companies and ordinary citizens alike. Basically, they can afford to minimize regulation or afford to avoid it entirely by tying up such laws in courts or challenging them directly to the point where local or state governments just remove them from the books to avoid a costly legal fight. They can use their wealth and power to slow or even halt enforcement of laws that are legal and constitutional, tying them up in the courts for years, even decades at a time. And then any law that we enact can be challenged in court, and it gives us no guarantee that any law that we enact will actually hold a court challenge, or will actually withstand a court challenge by a major corporation. In effect, the law cannot be applied equally amongst we the people. Are there any clarifying questions before I hop in to what we can do about it, basically? Well, the nature of corporations is that they still have certain statutory privileges, rights that are created by the state specifically for their purpose. So this allows them not only to sue, but also to be sued. It allows them to pool their resources and pool their risk so that individual shareholders and company operators are not necessarily held accountable for the wrongdoing of their organization as a whole. And with their for-profit treasuries that they operate, they can also afford to tie up any criminal violations in court for decades at a time. Chevron most recently did that with a Ecuadorian community where they were found to have contaminated their water supply and polluted their local environments, and that was back in the 1980s, 89 if I'm not mistaken. But basically, they have the resources and the support to tie up any kind of attempt to hold them accountable for the environmental destruction that they do.
So in other words, they have all the privileges of being a person and none of the liabilities.
Exactly. Individuals, we would never get away with that. We'd be in jail quick. But corporations can afford to stay out of jail. And not to mention, you can't put a corporation in jail, and you can't put the CEOs and the shareholders in jail from that. Individual workers who violate their crime, or who violate the law, they can be put into jail, but not the executives.
So that's why they don't shut these corporations down when they do heinous things.
Right. And here's the funny thing, too. Before their corporations were recognized as people with constitutional rights, they were kept on very strict leash. Basically, those corporate charters that had to be created from a law created by the state legislature and then approved by the governor's office were also limited in their duration. Typically about 20, 25 years max, and then they would have to go through the entire process again. And if corporations were found to have violated local, state, or federal laws, their corporate charters were subject to revocation. They could be literally revoked, the death penalty for a corporation, and then their assets dissolved and liquidated amongst the remaining members. But thanks to the Supreme Court, now all you have to do to become incorporated is basically apply to a state law clerk and spend a $250 application fee, and guess what? You're a corporation. Not only are you incorporated and get to pool risk and resources, but you also can do whatever you want. You are not specified to work for the public good. It's simply to work towards wealth maximization. And then you are also given the power to basically do or work far outside the scope of your original purpose. So Walmart, Amazon, ExxonMobil even, Chevron, they can, Monsanto, they can work in multiple different industries doing completely different than what they originally set out to do, all from one corporate charter. Furthermore, they can live forever. Their corporate charters do not end. The state cannot revoke them. It basically allows them to live indefinitely. So that's how we actually see corporations like Chevron. What does Chevron used to be called? Anybody remember? Standard Oil.
Oh.
Yeah, back in the late 19th century, early 20th century.
This is supposed to be justice, right? Supreme Court justice.
Right. Justice for who? And who do the people serve? Obviously, it seems that that justice is bent towards corporate interests and property over human well-being and environmental sustainability. So as long as these corporations are allowed to claim unlimited rights, we cannot apply the law equally, and it is the communities on the front lines of corporate rule that are going to suffer the most through environmental degradation, contamination to pollution, and of course, man-made climate change, which has only been accelerating over the last 10 years. This is why we're still dealing with such a hot day like this in the Bay Area, and why it's only going to get hotter, and we're going to see more worse storms like Hurricane Irma that's happening right now, and more precipitation periods, and harsher rain, harsher winters, harsher summers, everything. But there's some things that we the people can do, real people can do, to actually change the flow of where we're going. So the first step would be to abolish corporate constitutional rights. Move to Amend, as I mentioned, has a proposed amendment in Congress right now. It's called We the People Amendment, also known as House Resolution 48. If you look at the brochure there, you can see the language of it and so forth. House Resolution 48 is the bill number. It's in the House of Representatives right now. It was introduced earlier this year by Minnesota Representative Rick Nolan, and currently has 44 co-sponsors and counting. So we're working towards passing that amendment. What you can do, absent of joining the coalition outright, is to lobby your House representative and your senators. Lobby your House representative to co-sponsor House Resolution 48, and then ask your senator to introduce the We the People Amendment in the Senate for the first time. It's our strategic goal for this year to get this We the People Amendment introduced in the Senate for the first time with at least 5 co-sponsors. So ask Kamala Harris, ask Dianne Feinstein to introduce the We the People Amendment and join their colleagues in the House in support of an amendment that makes clear corporations are not people, constitutional rights belong to human beings, and that money is not equal to speech, so that it can be regulated in elections. Another thing you can do too in the immediate term is join together with grassroots organizations working in solidarity with frontline communities. There are plenty of organizations out there like the Sierra Club, there is the grassroots or the Global Grassroots Justice Alliance, and Climate Justice Action, all sorts of organizations that are working right now that you can directly get involved with, and most importantly, work in solidarity with the communities that are most impacted, frontline communities that live on the fronts of these plains. They need support, and it goes into our principle of solidarity organizing. We need to meet people where they live and acknowledge their experiences for what they are, not just asking them to do what we want them to do or asking them to put down the issues that matter most to them. They do not, absolutely not. Undocumented community in particular is particularly vulnerable for this community because not only can corporations freely violate their human rights, but then they can never report it to local, state, or federal governments out of fear that they may be incarcerated and deported, which, mind you, there is also a for-profit private prison industry that runs many of the detention centers, which, very convenient that Donald Trump would exponentially increase the amount of immigration raids and target undocumented and migrant individuals for deportation and detention. They're giving pretty well to the Republican Party right now. They're making a windfall. But most importantly, too, you can start conversations with your family, friends, and neighbors right now about the nature of corporate constitutional rights and how corporate influence is involved in every aspect of your daily lives. If you're going to a grocery store, you're going to you're basically choosing products that were produced by 10 multinational corporations. Over 99% of what you buy at a grocery store comes from 10 multinational corporations. If you go to a bank, more than half of the wealth in our financial institutions is controlled by just 10 financial institutions. And then if you watch TV, listen to the radio, read the newspaper, more than literally 90% of what we read, watch, and listen to is controlled by just 6, soon to be 5 corporations, basically. So every aspect that you can think of in our lives has corporations directly involved in it. So we need to spread the word about how these corporations are able to influence us, able to undermine and manipulate our rights for their own benefits using corporate constitutional rights. How can you get involved with Move to Amend? There are many ways, and it doesn't always, not all of which involve simply joining the coalition. If you're an individual, you can sign the motion to amend at the URL that's listed there, or sign a paper petition at any local affiliate groups located nearest you. In fact, right here in the Bay Area, there's a local Move to Amend chapter that's based here in Oakland. And then there's another one that's based in San Jose, in Santa Clara County, that you can get involved with. They tend to have monthly affiliate meetings where all are welcome to join in, learn more about how to get involved. So joining joining a local affiliate group is another option. But most importantly, sign the petition, which I will pass around here for you. And feel free to add your name. You don't have to add all the information as long as we have your zip code. But this basically allows us, when we go to our representatives and our senators, asking them to support this amendment, we present them with the names of people who are in their district who support this as well. And that's heavily influential because they know that the people that elected them want them to support this amendment. So share the petition around as well. Share that URL. You can easily print off the petition online on our website, movetoamend.org/petitions. We offer those up there, and then you can submit them online to us. You can mail them to our office, whichever way works best for you. Furthermore, you can also join our national coalition if you're an organization by endorsing Move to Amend. Go to movetoamend.org/organizations, and you can see not only the list of hundreds of organizations that have already endorsed this campaign, but then you can